Get out of my sight. Now.
Sir, I'm your server tonight.
I asked for someone who speaks Chinese. Not some ghetto girl who can barely speak English. Pick that up and walk.
She didn't bend down.
I speak 4 languages, sir.
He laughed loud enough to turn heads.
Your mama worked the streets just so you could pass 3rd grade. And you think you're special?
She stepped closer.
Say what you want about me, but my mother, I'm assigned here. You're not big enough. I'm leaving.
Fine.
$100,000 says you can't say 1 cent in Chinese. Not one.
She didn't step back.
Say it louder, so the whole restaurant hears.
60 people were in that room. Every one of them would be on their feet before the night was over. But not for him. The bet hung in the air like smoke. Gerald Covington, real estate developer, net worth north of $300 million. He'd built half the waterfront condos in San Francisco. Tonight he was hosting a Chinese investment delegation, 4 guests led by a man named Mr. Shu, trying to close a $90 million deal. That's who this man was, the kind of man who bought silence with money and measured people by their usefulness. And right now, he was staring down a waitress who refused to leave. The dining room had gone quiet, not silent, but that specific kind of quiet where forks slow down and conversations turn to whispers, 60 people pretending not to watch, every single one of them watching. Gerald straightened his tie and looked at his guests. "Don't worry, this'll be over in a second." But Mr. Shu wasn't smiling. He leaned toward his wife and said something low, quiet, in Mandarin. Just 2 sentences. His wife nodded slightly. The 2 associates at the end of the table exchanged a glance. Nobody at that table understood what he said, except one person, Whitney Sawyer, 28 years old, server at Harmon and Vine for 2 years, 4 languages. Not one person in that restaurant knew that about her. Not her manager, not the head waiter, not even Douglas Harmon, the man who owned the place. Because nobody had ever asked. She stood 3 steps from the table. Her back was almost turned, but she heard every word Mr. Shu said, and she understood all of it. What did he say? He told his wife in Mandarin, "This man talks about respect, but treats his own people like furniture." Whitney's stride changed, just barely. Her chin lifted half an inch. Her fingers curled at her side. She was 3 feet from the kitchen door. She could walk through it, clock out, go home, forget the whole thing. Let Gerald win. Let the $20 bill on the floor be the last word. But she stopped, and she turned around. Not fast, not angry, slow, like someone who just made a decision they'd been waiting their whole life to make. She walked back to the table, not rushing, not hesitating, each step deliberate, the kind of calm that only comes from someone who's been underestimated so many times it stopped hurting and started becoming fuel. Gerald saw her coming and smirked. "Oh, she's back. What, you want to embarrass yourself in front of my guests?" She didn't look at him. She looked at Mr. Shu, and she opened her mouth and spoke in flawless Mandarin. Not broken, not rehearsed, not phrasebook Mandarin that tourists use to order noodles. This was fluid, tonal, precise, with a slight Beijing accent that made Mr. Shu's eyebrows rise before she even finished her first sentence. She said, "Mr. Shu, I apologize for the interruption. I'd be happy to walk you through tonight's tasting menu. The chef has prepared a special duck course that I think pairs beautifully with the wine on page 3. Every word in Mandarin, every tone correct, every syllable carrying the kind of ease that only comes from years, not months, not semesters, years of living inside a language. The table went dead silent. Gerald's smile collapsed like a building with no foundation. His hand froze around his whiskey glass. Raymond Cross, his business partner, slowly put down his fork. Gerald's wife Lillian pressed her fingers to her lips. And Mr. Shu, the man Gerald had been trying to impress all night, leaned forward with the first real interest he'd shown since sitting down. He responded, in Mandarin, testing her. "You speak very well. Where did you study?" Whitney didn't hesitate. Still in Mandarin. She told him she didn't study in a university. She learned in a grocery store, in Chinatown, from the women who ran the fish counter on Stockton Street, from the aunties who argued over the price of bok choy every Saturday morning. Mr. Shu laughed, a real laugh, not polite, not performative, the kind of laugh that escapes when something catches you completely off guard. He turned to his wife and said, "She sounds like she grew up in Beijing." Gerald cut in, loud, in English. "Okay, cute party trick. But speaking a few sentences and handling a real business conversation are two very different things." Whitney turned to him, still calm, still composed, like she had all the time in the world. "Would you like me to translate what your guests have been discussing for the last 10 minutes, Mr. Covington? Because they've raised 3 concerns about your waterfront proposal, and I don't think you caught any of them." Dead. Silence. Not restaurant silence. The kind of silence where you can hear ice melting in a glass, where the air conditioning sounds loud, where 60 people hold their breath at the same time without knowing it. Mr. Shu leaned back in his chair. He looked at Gerald, then at Whitney, then back at Gerald. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Gerald's face went from red to white. His jaw moved, but nothing came out. For the first time all night, maybe for the first time in years, Gerald Covington had absolutely nothing to say. The $20 bill was still on the floor where it landed. Nobody had picked it up. Nobody had even looked at it. But everyone was looking at Whitney Sawyer. Raymond Cross stared at her like he was recalculating something in his head. Lillian Covington stared at her like she was seeing a ghost. The 2 Chinese associates at the end of the table were whispering to each other. Fast, excited, the way people talk when they've just witnessed something they'll tell their friends about tomorrow. And Gerald? Gerald gripped his whiskey glass so hard his knuckles went white. Because the woman he told to fetch a $20 bill off the floor just exposed every gap in his $90 million deal, in the language he bet she couldn't speak. And the whole restaurant heard it. Whitney Sawyer didn't learn Mandarin in a classroom. She learned it the way most people learn to breathe, by being surrounded by it every single day until it became part of her. Her mother died when she was 6. Car accident. No insurance, no savings, no plan. Her grandmother, Evelyn Sawyer, raised her after that. Evelyn was a cleaning lady, 76 years old now, spent 35 years scrubbing floors and wiping counters in San Francisco's Chinatown, not because she loved it, because it was the only work that didn't ask for a diploma. Every day after school, Whitney sat on a plastic stool behind the counter of a Cantonese grocery store on Stockton Street. Homework spread out next to crates of dried shrimp and boxes of jasmine tea. The owner's wife would help her with math. The fish counter ladies would argue in Cantonese 3 feet from her ear. Mandarin played on a radio behind the register all day, every day, for years. She didn't study the language. She absorbed it, the way a sponge absorbs water, not by trying, but by being there. By 9, she was translating for her grandmother at the grocery store. By 12, the shop owner's wife was teaching her to read Chinese characters after closing time. By 15, she was helping elderly Chinatown residents fill out government forms in English and translating their medical prescriptions from Mandarin. She graduated top of her high school class. Full ride should have been automatic. It wasn't. Scholarships fell through, paperwork errors, funding cuts, bureaucratic gaps that had nothing to do with merit and everything to do with a system that wasn't built for people like her. So she enrolled in community college, worked nights, taught herself French from library audiobooks during bus rides, picked up Spanish from co-workers at her second job. Languages weren't a hobby for Whitney. They were survival, Right now, she was 3 years into saving for a graduate program in linguistics, $11,000 short. Every shift at Harmon and Vine was another $200 closer. That's who Gerald Covington just threw a wine list at. A woman who'd been fluent in his blind spot her entire life. Gerald Covington didn't get to $300 million by losing arguments in public. He got there by doubling down until the other person quit. So that's exactly what he did. He pulled out his phone, tapped the screen 3 times, then slid it across the table toward Whitney, right through the puddle of condensation from his whiskey glass. Read it. On the screen was a document, dense, Mandarin characters, small font. It was the preliminary term sheet for the waterfront deal, the actual investment contract between Gerald's company and Mr. Shu's firm. Read it out loud, translate it, right now, in front of everyone. He was betting on something specific. Conversational Mandarin and written business Chinese are completely different skills. You can chat with aunties at a fish market your whole life and still not be able to read a legal contract. He knew that. He was counting on it. Unless that's above your pay grade, he added, which, let's be honest, everything at this table is. By now, the performance had an audience. The couple at the next table had stopped eating entirely. A woman by the window was holding her phone under the table, recording. 2 servers stood frozen near the kitchen door, watching through the glass. Whitney picked up the phone. She didn't grab it, she lifted it. The way a surgeon lifts a scalpel, with precision and zero hesitation. Her eyes moved across the screen, line by line, not frantically, not slowly, with the steady rhythm of someone who reads dense text the way most people read a menu. Then she started translating, out loud, in English, clear as glass. Clause 1, equity stake percentages. She broke it down. Who owns what triggers a dilution event, what the cap structure looks like. Clause 2, liability limitations. She translated the sub-clauses, flagged the mutual indemnity language, and noted that the English equivalent would typically use the phrase, hold harmless, which wasn't reflected in Gerald's English draft. Then she hit Clause 3. She stopped. This non-compete provision, she said, still looking at the screen. The phrasing here is ambiguous. In standard Mandarin legal writing, this could mean the non-compete applies to subsidiaries only. But in Shanghai Regional Convention, this same phrasing extends to individual officers. Your English draft treats it as subsidiaries only. That's a gap, and depending on which interpretation the court applies, it could cost you the entire exclusivity clause. She set the phone down, looked at Gerald, waited. The entire table looked at Mr. Shu. Mr. Shu uncrossed his arms, slowly. Then he nodded. She is correct, he said. In English, clear enough for everyone to hear. We raised this exact concern with your legal team last week, Mr. Covington. They dismissed it. Gerald didn't respond. His jaw was locked, his hand flat on the table. Lillian Covington looked at Whitney, and the expression on her face wasn't surprise anymore. It was something deeper, something that looked a lot like recognition, the kind that comes from being underestimated by the same man for a very long time. Gerald's voice came out low, controlled, tight as a wire. Anyone can memorize legal phrases. That doesn't mean she belongs at this table. Nobody agreed with him. Not out loud, not even with a nod. The silence at that table said everything. And the $20 bill was still on the floor. Here's the thing about Gerald Covington that most people don't know. He wasn't born rich. He grew up in a 2-bedroom house in Sacramento. His father sold used cars. His mother worked the front desk at a motel. He wore the same 3 shirts to school for 2 years straight and got laughed at for it. He built his empire from nothing. No inheritance, no connections, no Ivy League degree, just confidence, timing, and the ability to make people believe he was always the most important person in the room. And that's exactly why Whitney Sawyer terrified him. Not because she spoke Mandarin, not because she found a flaw in his contract, but because she broke the only rule Gerald had ever lived by, that people like her don't get to be smarter than people like him. That the hierarchy he'd spent 30 years climbing was real. That the world made sense the way he'd arranged it. When someone like Whitney threatens that, Gerald doesn't see talent. He sees a threat to everything he believes about himself. So he did what men like him always do. He went to the man with the power to make her disappear. He found Douglas Harmon near the bar. Douglas was polishing a glass, not because it needed polishing, but because that's what he did when he was watching his dining room carefully. "Doug," Gerald's voice was low but sharp. "Your waitress just embarrassed me in front of a $90 million delegation. I need her gone. Tonight." Douglas didn't look up from the glass. "She translated a legal document your own lawyers couldn't get right. I'm not sure she's the one who should be embarrassed. I've brought clients here for 8 years. I spend $200,000 a year at this restaurant. You really want to lose all of that? Over a waitress?" Douglas set the glass down, slowly. Then he looked Gerald dead in the eyes. "I've run this restaurant for 22 years, Gerald. I've never once asked a guest to leave. Don't make tonight the first time." Gerald stared at him, then walked away without a word. Back in the kitchen, Derek Tolles, head waiter, been on staff for 6 years, pulled Whitney aside near the dish station. "I saw what you did out there." His voice was quiet but serious. "And I get it, I do. But Covington is connected. He could make your life very difficult. You sure this is the hill?" Whitney was retying her apron, hands steady, eyes focused. "Derek, he bet $100,000 I couldn't speak Chinese." She pulled the knot tight. "He didn't bet I wouldn't." Derek looked at her for a long moment, then shook his head, not in disagreement, in something closer to admiration. Word spread through the kitchen fast. The sous chef heard first, then the dishwasher, then the sommelier. One by one, the staff started drifting toward the kitchen door, peering through the glass window at the dining room like something was about to happen that they didn't want to miss. Because something was shifting, not just at Gerald's table, in the whole building. You could feel it, the way you feel a storm coming before the sky changes. The air gets heavier, people talk less, everyone starts paying attention. Gerald Covington had money, he had power, he had connections that could close doors with a phone call. But tonight, in this restaurant, he was losing something no amount of money could buy back. And he knew it. What happened next changed the entire power dynamic at that table. Mr. Shu called Douglas Harmon over, quietly, respectfully, the way a man speaks when he's about to make a request he considers important. "Mr. Harmon, I have an unusual ask. Would you allow Miss Sawyer to serve as an informal interpreter for the rest of this dinner? Not as a waitress, as a linguistic consultant." He paused, then added, "Your server understood our contract better than the law firm Mr. Covington hired. I'd prefer to work with her." Douglas looked at Whitney. Whitney gave a single nod. "She's all yours," Douglas said. And just like that, Whitney Sawyer walked back to Gerald Covington's table, but not as the woman he dismissed, not as the waitress he told to fetch a 20 off the floor. She returned at the specific request of the guests of honor, the people Gerald was trying to impress, the people holding $90 million. The power shift was physical. You could see it in the seating. Whitney now stood between Gerald and Mr. Shu. And Gerald, the man who'd been running the table all night, had to speak through her to communicate with his own investors. Think about that. The woman he tried to remove was now the bridge between him and everything he wanted. The dinner continued. And over the next 20 minutes, Whitney didn't just translate words, she translated cultures. When Gerald cracked a joke about getting this deal done fast the American way, Whitney knew it would land wrong. In Chinese business culture, rushing signals disrespect. So she softened the phrasing, kept the energy, removed the edge. Mr. Shu smiled instead of stiffening. When Mrs. Shu asked a pointed question about the environmental impact of the waterfront project, she asked it formally. In Mandarin, the level of formality tells you how serious the concern is. Whitney translated it with the full weight of that formality, and Gerald, for once, gave a serious answer instead of brushing it off. When one of the associates brought up a zoning regulation in Mandarin that had no clean English equivalent, Whitney broke it down in 3 sentences. Clear, accurate, no filler. She wasn't just translating, she was saving the deal. And the irony was so thick you could choke on it. The woman Gerald wanted gone, the woman he called ghetto, the woman whose mother he insulted, was the only reason his $90 million deal was still breathing. Mr. Shu's body language changed completely. His shoulders dropped. He leaned forward instead of back. He started speaking more openly, sharing concerns he'd clearly been holding back. His associates pulled out notebooks and started writing. For the first time all evening, the conversation at that table felt real. Raymond Cross, Gerald's silent partner, had been watching everything without saying a word for the last hour. He leaned close to Gerald and whispered something. "She just saved your deal. You know that, right?" Gerald didn't respond. He lifted his whiskey glass and drank, long and slow. The kind of drink a man takes when he's swallowing something other than liquor. The sommelier stood in the doorway, watching. A busboy stopped mid-step with a tray of dirty plates. 2 servers leaned against the far wall, pretending to fold napkins but not folding anything. The whole restaurant could feel it. Something had tipped. Something that wasn't going to tip back. And through it all, through every translated sentence, every cultural bridge, every quiet correction that kept the deal alive, the $20 bill sat on the floor where it had landed an hour ago. Nobody picked it up. Nobody even looked at it anymore. It didn't mean anything now. After the main course, Douglas Harmon walked to the table. Not the casual stroll of a restaurant owner checking on guests. This was different. His back was straight. His steps were deliberate. He was carrying something in his posture that everyone in the room recognized without being told. Authority. He stopped at the head of the table and addressed Mr. Shu directly. "Mr. Shu, I want you to know something about Miss Sawyer. She's been a member of my team for 2 years. She speaks 4 languages fluently, and she is the most reliable person on my staff." He paused. "Whatever she's contributed tonight, it's not a surprise to me. It's overdue. Now, here's the truth." Douglas didn't know. Not the full extent. He knew Whitney was sharp. He knew she was dependable. But 4 languages, business-level Mandarin, legal translation on the spot? He had no idea. But he said it anyway. Because Douglas Harmon understood something that Gerald Covington never would. In that room, at that moment, Whitney's talent needed a roof over it. She needed someone with institutional authority to stand next to her and say, "She belongs here." That's not deception. That's leadership. Mr. Shu listened carefully. Then he pushed his chair back and stood. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card, but he didn't hand it over casually. He held it with both hands, the traditional Chinese gesture of respect, and extended it toward Whitney. "Ms. Sawyer, my firm employs over 200 bilingual consultants in Shanghai. Not one of them translates with your instinct." He held her gaze. "I'd like to offer you a position on my cross-cultural advisory team, starting immediately." The table went still. Gerald's face drained of color like someone pulled a plug. Lillian covered her mouth with her hand. Raymond Cross leaned back in his chair and let out a long breath. The 2 associates at the end of the table looked at each other with wide eyes, and Whitney, for the first time all night, lost her composure. Just for a second, just enough to notice. Her eyes glistened. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She blinked twice fast and looked down at the business card in Mr. Shu's hands. This wasn't part of the plan. She didn't come back to this table looking for a career. She came back because a man told her she couldn't speak. That was it. That was the whole reason. And now a man who ran a global firm was standing in front of her offering to change her life. She took the card. Both hands. A slight bow of her head, a cultural gesture so natural that Mr. Shu noticed it immediately. His expression softened. The kind of softening that happens when someone surprises you not with what they know, but with who they are. "Mr. Shu, I'm honored." Her voice was steady, but her hands weren't. She was gripping the edge of her notepad so hard her knuckles paled. Can I have a moment to think about that?" Mr. Shu smiled. Not a business smile. A real one. "Take your time. But not too long." Gerald stared at the table. His jaw was working back and forth, grinding on something he couldn't swallow. His waitress. The woman he'd told to shoo. The woman whose mother he'd insulted. She just got offered a job at the table he was paying for, by the man he'd spent 6 months trying to impress. And the question that hung in the air was louder than anything anyone had said all night. Would she take it? What about her graduate school dream? And what about that $100,000 bet that still hadn't been settled? Gerald was at the bar, third scotch, staring at nothing. That's when his wife made her move. Lillian Covington didn't go to the bar. She went to the service station near the kitchen, where Whitney was standing alone, refilling a water pitcher with hands that still weren't steady. "Ms. Sawyer." Whitney looked up. Whatever she expected. It wasn't this. Not Gerald's wife. Not that expression on her face, not the crack in her voice. "I want to apologize for my husband." Lillian's words were quiet but precise. "Not because he asked me to. He didn't. Because I should have said something at that table and I didn't. That's on me." Whitney set the pitcher down. "You don't need to apologize for someone else's words, ma'am. I know." Lillian's eyes were wet. "But silence is its own kind of word, isn't it?" Neither of them spoke for a moment. The kitchen noise filled the gap. Dishes clanking, the hiss of a stove, someone calling out an order, but between these two women the silence said more than any sentence could. Lillian wasn't a villain. She wasn't cruel. She was a woman who'd spent 20 years sitting next to a man who spoke for her, over her, and through her. And tonight, watching Whitney refuse to be silenced, something inside her cracked open. She squeezed Whitney's hand once, then walked back to the dining room without another word. Whitney stood there for a moment, then she stepped into the staff hallway, pulled out her phone, and made a call. It rang 3 times. "Nai. Grandmother," she said it soft, almost a whisper. Her grandmother's voice came through, thin, tired, warm. The voice of a 76-year-old woman who'd spent the day cleaning someone else's house. "Someone offered me a job tonight, Grandma. A real job. Because I spoke Chinese." The line went quiet. Not the awkward kind. The kind of quiet that happens when someone is holding the phone against their chest because they can't speak yet. Then Evelyn Sawyer said, "I always told those ladies at the shop, my granddaughter listens better than anyone." Whitney pressed her back against the hallway wall, closed her eyes. The hallway smelled like espresso and lemon polish. Through the door, she could hear the muffled sound of the dining room, laughter, clinking glasses, conversations carrying on like the world hadn't just shifted on its axis. But it had. She opened her eyes when she heard footsteps. Derek was standing at the end of the hallway. He didn't say much. He never did. He just walked over, put a hand on her shoulder, and said 5 words. "You didn't make waves tonight." She looked at him. "You changed the tide." Then he walked back toward the dining room, and Whitney stood there for one more breath, just one, before straightening her apron, squaring her shoulders, and following him through the door. The night wasn't over yet. Gerald Covington came back from the bar with a different look in his eyes. Not defeated. Recalibrated. He'd had 3 scotches. He wasn't drunk. Gerald didn't get drunk in public. But the alcohol had done what it always did for men like him. It turned embarrassment into strategy, humiliation into a plan. He sat down, buttoned his jacket, and addressed the entire table. "Look, I'll admit it. She speaks Chinese. Fine. Credit where it's due. He paused. Let the concession breathe. Then he leaned forward. But I made a bet. $100,000, and I'm a man of my word. So let's make it official. He pulled out his phone again. I'm going to get a certified Mandarin interpreter on video call right now. If your waitress passes a professional-grade translation test, legal, medical, and technical, live in front of all of us, I'll write the check tonight. He looked at Whitney. But if she fails even one section, she admits it was a parlor trick, apologizes to my guests, and walks out of this restaurant for good. The stakes had just doubled. This wasn't about $100,000 anymore. This was about Whitney's dignity, her job, her future at Harmon and Vine. Gerald was betting on something specific, street fluency versus professional certification. He'd seen Whitney speak. He'd watched her translate a contract. But a formal test, administered by an expert, that was a different arena. That was where self-taught falls apart, where the gap between immersion and education is supposed to show. He was counting on that gap. Mr. Shu looked at Whitney. Douglas, standing near the bar, looked at Whitney. Derek, watching from the kitchen doorway, looked at Whitney. The whole restaurant was holding its breath. Whitney set down her tray. Call them. 2 words. No hesitation. No bluff. Just the quiet confidence of someone who'd been preparing for this moment since she was 9 years old, on a plastic stool in a Chinatown grocery store. Gerald dialed. The screen flickered. A face appeared. A woman in her 50s, professional background, bookshelf behind her. Dr. Pamela Greer, court-certified Mandarin interpreter, 20 years of experience. She'd translated for federal courts, international trade commissions, and the United Nations. Gerald explained the situation in 30 seconds. Dr. Greer raised an eyebrow but agreed. I'll administer 3 standard challenges: legal, medical, cultural. These are the same tests we use for federal certification. She looked at Whitney through the screen. Are you ready, Miss Sawyer? Yes, ma'am. Challenge 1. Legal. Dr. Greer read a paragraph from a Sino-American joint venture agreement. Dense. Technical. Full of terms that don't translate cleanly, liability structures, fiduciary obligations, subordination clauses. Whitney listened, then translated, section by section, clear, precise. She didn't stumble once. She didn't pause for more than a breath between sentences. She handled the legal terminology like she'd been reading contracts her whole life. Dr. Greer's expression shifted, just slightly. The professional mask cracked half an inch. Accurate, excellent register. Gerald didn't move. Challenge 2. Medical. A patient intake form from a Chinese hospital. This was harder. Medical terminology is specialized in every language. But in Mandarin, it's particularly dense. Characters that look similar mean completely different things. One wrong tone and a diagnosis becomes a different organ. Whitney started translating. Steady. Confident. Then she hit a term, a rare hepatological phrase that even native speakers sometimes trip over. She paused. The room tightened. Gerald leaned forward. This was it. This was the crack he'd been waiting for. Whitney closed her eyes for 2 seconds. Then she broke the characters down, radical by radical, component by component, and rebuilt the meaning from the ground up. The way someone does when they've learned a language not from textbooks, but from the structure of the characters themselves. Hepatic portal hypertension, secondary to biliary atresia, she said. Dr. Greer stared at the screen for a long moment. That's a term most of my colleagues would need to look up, Miss Sawyer. Gerald's leaned forward posture slowly sank back into his chair. Challenge 3. Cultural and idiomatic. Dr. Greer's voice changed, softer now, almost respectful. This last one is above professional level. I want to be transparent about that. This is academic. She read a passage from a classical Chinese essay. Not modern Mandarin, literary Chinese, the kind of writing that predates the modern language by centuries. dense with metaphor, layered with historical allusion, the kind of text that PhD candidates struggle with. "Take your time," Dr. Greer said. Whitney listened. The whole passage, eyes closed, hands still at her sides. When Dr. Greer finished reading, the dining room was so quiet you could hear the candles flickering. Whitney opened her eyes, and she translated. Not word for word. That would have been impossible with classical Chinese. She translated the meaning, the metaphor, the tone. She found English words that carried the same weight as characters written 1,000 years ago. She captured the poetry without losing the precision. When she finished, no one moved. Dr. Greer took off her glasses, set them on her desk, and said, on camera, visible to every person at that table and to the dozen diners who had gathered behind Gerald's chair to watch, "In 20 years of certified translation work, I have never seen someone with this level of fluency who doesn't hold a formal degree in the language. Ms. Sawyer, wherever you learned it completely." The room exhaled. Mr. Shu closed his eyes and nodded slowly. Mrs. Shu pressed both hands together. Raymond Cross rubbed his forehead like a man who'd just watched something he'd be thinking about for years. Gerald Covington sat perfectly still. Then he reached into his inside jacket pocket and pulled out a checkbook. He didn't do it gracefully, he didn't smile, he didn't make a speech. He opened the checkbook, uncapped a pen, and wrote in silence. Slow, deliberate strokes, the handwriting of a man who was paying for something he never believed he'd owe. He tore the check from the book, placed it on the table. $100,000. It landed right next to the $20 bill, the same bill he'd flicked at her chest 2 hours ago. The bill that had sat on the floor all night like a symbol of everything he thought she was worth. $20, next to $100,000. Whitney looked at both. Then she picked up the check and folded it once. Clean, precise. Then she reached down, slowly, and picked up the $20 bill. The one that had been on the floor since the first 5 minutes of the night. She held it for a moment, turned it over in her fingers. Then she placed it on the table in front of Gerald. "Keep it. You need it more than I do." The room erupted. It started with one person. Mr. Shu pushed his chair back and stood. Not fast, not dramatic. The way a man stands when he wants everyone to understand that what he's doing is deliberate. He brought his hands together and began to clap. Slow, measured, each clap landing like a period at the end of a sentence. His wife stood next, then the 2 associates. 4 people from the same table, the table that started all of this, standing and applauding a woman in a black apron. Then it spread. The couple at the next table. The woman dining alone by the window. She stood so fast her napkin fell to the floor and she didn't even notice. A man in a gray suit 3 tables over. 2 women celebrating a birthday near the back wall. The sommelier, still standing in the doorway, started clapping without even realizing his hands were moving. The hostess at the front desk. A busboy holding a tray of dirty plates. He set it down on the nearest surface and joined in. The bartender. A server who'd been watching through the kitchen window the entire night pushed through the door and stood in the dining room with tears running down her face. One by one, table by table, person by person. Within 30 seconds, every single person in Harmon and Vine was on their feet. 60 people, standing, clapping. Not the raucous, hollering kind of applause you hear at a concert. This was something different, quieter, heavier, the kind of recognition that comes from the gut, from watching something happen that you know you'll remember for the rest of your life. Whitney stood in the middle of it, black apron, name tag, $100,000 check folded in her hand, and she didn't know where to look. Her eyes went to the floor first, then to Derek, who was standing in the kitchen doorway with the entire staff behind him, dishwashers, line cooks, the sous chef, all of them crammed into the frame of that doorway like a family portrait nobody planned. Derek was clapping too, but he wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking at her. and he was nodding. Slow, steady. The nod of a man who'd just watched someone do the thing he always knew they could. Douglas Harmon waited until the applause softened. Then he walked to the center of the dining room. He didn't make a speech. Douglas wasn't that kind of man. He reached up to his own lapel and unpinned something. A small gold pin shaped like a vine leaf. It was the Harmon and Vine founding pin. Only 6 people had ever worn it. Douglas, his late wife, his original head chef, 3 others who'd been with him since the beginning 22 years ago. He walked to Whitney, took her apron strap gently between 2 fingers, and pinned it right above her name tag. "You've been staff for 2 years," he said, quiet enough that only she could hear, but the room was so silent that everyone heard anyway. "Tonight, your family." Whitney looked down at the pin. Her fingers touched it once, light, like she was checking to make sure it was real. Mr. Shu stepped forward next. He reached into his jacket, not for another business card, for the same card he'd offered earlier. But this time he held it differently. Both hands, a slight bow, the full gesture, the kind reserved for people you consider equals. "This offer is real, Ms. Sawyer. My Shanghai office will expect your call." He paused. "Take your time, but don't take too long." Whitney accepted the card with both hands, bowed her head slightly. The gesture was so natural, so culturally precise, that Mr. Shu's eyes widened for just a moment before softening into a smile. The first truly warm smile anyone had seen from him all evening. Then Raymond Cross stood up, Gerald's business partner, the man who'd been silent the entire night, the man who'd sat through every insult, every humiliation, every moment of Gerald's performance without saying a single word. He spoke now. "I've spent 20 years in private equity. I've sat across from MBAs, PhDs, and Rhodes Scholars." He looked at Whitney. "I don't think any of them could have done what I just watched. Ms. Sawyer, if you ever want to consult for our firm, you have my number." He placed his business card on the table. Then something unscripted happened. The woman who'd been dining alone by the window, the one whose napkin fell when she stood, walked over. She introduced herself as the director of a nonprofit language education program in Oakland. She placed her card next to Raymond's, then another person, a man who ran a translation agency, then a woman who worked in international development, then a couple who owned a chain of language schools in the Bay Area. One by one, business cards appeared on the table in front of Whitney. 11 cards total, 11 doors that didn't exist an hour ago. Gerald Covington watched all of it. Then he stood, buttoned his jacket. The room went quiet again, a different kind of quiet, the kind where everyone is watching to see what happens next. He looked at Whitney for a long moment, not with anger, not with shame, with something more complicated than either. "I underestimated you," he said. "That's the most expensive mistake I've made in a long time." Then he walked toward the door. Lillian stayed behind for a moment, just long enough to find Whitney's hand and squeeze it once. Then she followed her husband into the night. The dining room exhaled. Whitney stood at that table, surrounded by 11 business cards, wearing a gold pin that only 6 people in 22 years had ever worn, holding a check for more money than she'd made in the last 3 years combined. And then she said something that turned the whole night on its head one more time. She looked at Douglas, then at Derek, then at the kitchen staff still crowded in the doorway. "I want to put half of this toward the graduate program I've been saving for." She held up the check. "And the other half? I want to start a fund for kids who grew up like me, between languages, between worlds, the ones nobody ever thinks to ask what they know." Douglas nodded slowly. "I'll match it." From across the table, Mr. Shu, still standing, spoke without hesitation. "So will I." The $20 bill was gone from the table. Nobody remembered when it disappeared. Nobody cared. But the gold pin on Whitney's apron caught the light every time she moved, and it would stay there, long after the plates were cleared, the candles burned down, and the last guest walked out into the San Francisco night. Whitney Sawyer enrolled in the graduate linguistics program at San Francisco State that fall. She completed it in 18 months, while consulting part-time for Mr. Shu's firm remotely from her apartment in the Sunset District. The same apartment she'd been living in since community college. The same kitchen table where she used to practice Chinese characters with a ballpoint pen and a stack of napkins from work. The fund she started, the Evelyn Sawyer Bilingual Youth Initiative, awarded its first 12 scholarships the following spring. All 12 went to children from immigrant communities in San Francisco, kids who spoke 2 languages at home and were told that neither one counted, kids who sat behind grocery counters and restaurant kitchens absorbing words that nobody would test them on until now. Gerald Covington closed his waterfront deal. 3 months late. Different terms. Lower equity stake. He never returned to Harmon and Vine, not once. Lillian Covington, however, made a quiet donation to the Evelyn Sawyer Fund 6 months later. She didn't attach her name, but Whitney knew. Douglas Harmon hung a framed photo behind the bar. It showed Whitney standing in the dining room on the night it happened, black apron, gold vine pin, the check in her hand. Underneath the photo, a small brass plate read 4 words. Talent doesn't wait to be invited. Derek Tolles was promoted to floor manager. On his first day, he taped a handwritten note inside the staff locker room. It said, "If you speak something, speak up." Raymond Cross left Gerald's firm 8 months later. He started his own consulting company. Whitney was his first hire. So here's what I want to ask you. Tomorrow, at a restaurant, at a store, at a hospital, at a gas station, when someone serves you, when someone helps you, when someone does the quiet work that keeps the world turning, look at them. Really look, and ask them one question you've never asked before. Not, "Can I get the check?" Not, "Where's the bathroom?" Ask them something real, something human. You might be surprised. You might be standing in front of the next Whitney Sawyer, and you'd never know, unless you asked. If this story hit you, if it reminded you of someone or of yourself, drop a comment. Tell me, what's a talent you have that nobody knows about? I want to hear it. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe, because every week we find the people the world overlooked, and we tell their stories. And if you want to go even further, look up bilingual education programs in your city. Volunteer, mentor, donate. There are kids right now sitting behind a counter in a shop, absorbing a language that no one will ever test them on, until someone bets against them. The world doesn't lack talent. It lacks people willing to see it.
$100,000 written by the same hand that threw a $20 bill at her chest 2 hours earlier. That's how fast the world flips when someone finally speaks. Whitney didn't win because she spoke Mandarin. She won because she refused to let someone else, ignorance, and define what she was allowed to be. Gerald built a $300 million empire on one belief: that the hierarchy is real, that the person serving your table could never outsmart the person sitting at it. And Whitney shattered that in a single evening, not with anger, not with revenge, just by being exactly who she would always been, in a room that finally had no choice but to pay attention. But think about this. Whitney spoke 4 languages for years. Nobody knew. Not her manager, not her owner, nobody. Because nobody ever asked. So here's what I can't stop wondering. How many people have you walked past today who are carrying something extraordinary you never know about? And what if the only difference between being invincible and being undeniable is one moment where someone dares to listen? Drop a comment, Tell me, what's the talent you carry that nobody knows about? Like this video, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe, because every week we find the people the world overlooked. The world doesn't like talent, it likes people willing to see it.